All right, welcome. I know we're likely to have a few more join us as well, but I want to honor your time and go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. This is our second books on faith and meaning meeting, but our first one on over this technology. So. A couple of housekeeping details as we get started. First of all, you will hopefully have already gotten a little message as you logged in, but just to let you know again, this meeting is going to be recorded. That's largely just for archival purposes. Certainly if we were going to do anything that involved making use of your video, we would check in with you about that before we did anything with that, but just so you know. And then we've muted everyone by default so that we won't be disrupted by latecomers, as we already have some folks still joining us, even as we're getting started. But when you want to talk, just click the microphone icon in the bottom bar to mute or unmute yourself. And you can choose as you're comfortable to have your camera on or off. That's fine. I'm going to give some introductory comments, so you may want to go ahead and leave yourself muted until you finish, until I finish the sort of introduction to the text. But when I am talking or sharing my screen, if you have a thought that you want to send our way, please just write in the chat box. You can let me know if you can't see or hear something, or if you want to say post a question that way. My colleague Reagan Hayes and I will be monitoring your questions, and we can respond to as many as we can before the event's over. And I would just say, this is always the case with a Grace Farms Public. We're just really appreciative that you all share our values and having a respectful conversation. We know there's a lot going on in the world right now. Maintaining that respect, we just really appreciate that. And we do ask that you'd remain respectful of our entire audience as we have our conversation. So in case this is your first time in one of these conversations, just to sort of frame it most broadly, what this series is for, the Faith Initiative at Grace Farms is all motivated by a single question. And that question is, what is the shape of flourishing life? And we think that question has just huge, far-reaching implications. There's obviously so much more in that question, even than just to state it. That simply, when we believe that each one of us has a vision, whether we could articulate it or not, we each have at least an implicit vision of what we think flourishing life looks like. And that vision actually grounds, anytime we say we want to do good in the world, what we really mean is we want to contribute to flourishing life as we understand it. Every time we want to pursue justice in the world, well, that's all, it's sort of indexed over this particular sort of vision of flourishing life that we have. And then, and for this particular series, then the question we're bringing with us is, how can these texts help us make progress in our quest to answer this question? We've got a collection in the Grace Farms library, and I'm often asked, how did this collection come together? A lot of it boils down to the thought that, when we ask the fundamental question about flourishing life, we're not asking that on our own. We're not asking that in a vacuum. And so we want to take seriously the reflection that comes to us from the religious traditions, philosophical traditions that have handed on their wisdom to us. So what we're trying to do with this series is take sort of like metaphorically take a book or two or three off the shelf and say, well, what would it be like to pick up this book and read it in such a way that it would help us on our own quest to discover the shape of flourishing life. Now, that said, this series assumes that reading is not enough. But we do hope that texts can give us access to people, to histories, to ideas that, if we allow them to do their work on us, can actually contribute substantially to our quest. Texts can become the sort of germ or seed that sort of blossoms into a conversation and dialogue and a genuine encounter with another. Maybe that's someone else who's reading the book with us. Maybe that's someone who we encounter through the book, the author, or someone the book's author gives us access to in some way. I also, as we start today, just want to recognize, what's happening in the world right now. As we gather, we're mourning the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. It's important we speak their names in response to their killings. We are witnessing perhaps the most significant anti-racist movement in this country in at least 50 years. To be clear, these movements are not unrelated to the question of the shape of flourishing life. They are, when we had our first gathering, one of the books that we picked up was Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, one of the two books that King was said to regularly carry with him, the Bible and Jesus and the Disinherited. These questions about race in America aren't even, they're fundamental. They're not just extra credit over and above some more fundamental questions. The questions that these killings and the movements that are growing in response raise are the fundamental questions of our lives. What is a human being? Who counts as a human being? How are our identities rooted in and shaped by our histories, not just as individuals, but as peoples, as people groups, as races in a racialized society, our histories as a nation? And what does it mean to act justly when being honest about our history means there's no possibility of my justifying myself as a white American before my Black neighbors? In short, how can we recognize and contribute to the full flourishing of the humanity of another in real time and space, in real bodies? What does it mean to live lives worthy of our shared humanity? These questions and more are being asked on the streets. The actions happening on the streets are asking these and yet more difficult questions. And many of these questions, as we will see, bear on the book that we have selected to talk about today. How could they not? But I also just want to highlight that in 2 weeks' time, we will be convening another of these gatherings, and our text will be James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which will help us take up even more explicitly these realities of history and place and racialized bodies in America. Now, our text that we have for today is The Ethics of Authenticity by Charles Taylor. My well-worn and not all that presentable copy is here. And the stakes in this book, I take it, are this. This book is analyzing and talking about one of the most important ideas and one of the most dangerous ideas in the world right now. And yet, that is this idea of authenticity. And Taylor argues that this ideal is both inescapable for us as modern people, and yet also in need of deep refinement. And that's sort of like, that's the tight spot that he meets us in, tries to convince us that we're in, and really in certain ways like leaves us in, though not with some important help along the way. If you don't know Charles Taylor, which I wouldn't expect necessarily that you would, Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher. He is a philosopher of secularity, of modernity. His most important books, I think, are these two: Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity, and A Secular Age. And in both of these books, what he's trying to do is give an account of what it is to be a human being now. And he has a long sort of view of history that he's trying to bring to bear. So his question really is, how do we like rescue ourselves from our own sort of historical arrogance of sort of assuming that the way that we think about what it is to be a person, what it is to pursue meaning in our lives, that all of our intuitions have always been the intuitions of every human being who's ever walked the earth. That may be a particular ailment of particular folks, but Taylor thinks that's also a general problem that we all suffer from. And he's, to whatever extent we do suffer from that, he's trying to bring large swaths of intellectual history to bear to help us sort of denature what we always took for granted. And he's trying to tell the story about how we take everything that we took for granted and give it a history so that we understand that it didn't come from nowhere. That we as human beings don't come from nowhere. That in many ways, like one of the most important sort of things that I've learned from him is this just simple statement that of course you can get elsewhere as well, but this impulse that no one is located nowhere. Everyone's located somewhere. Everyone has a community. Everyone has a history. There are philosophers who in fact will explicitly argue for what they call the view from nowhere, and Taylor is very much in his philosophical work trying to argue against the possibility of such a thing. I mean, and trying to in fact tell the history of where a preference for such a so-called view from nowhere comes from, and show that the view from nowhere didn't come from nowhere, that it itself is located somewhere. And essentially the view from nowhere, I think, is an invention of like whiteness. It's an invention, it's a white discourse. It sort of imagines, it's part of white identity, as a sort of imagining oneself as like the universal human. And Taylor says, no, no one is located nowhere. And we all have to understand ourselves as historically located and socially located as well. So I want to share with you three sort of big ideas from this book. My sort of hope in this series, we're still trying to figure out the form, but if you've read this book, by all means, when we get to conversation in just a few minutes, I hope we can have some back and forth. If you haven't read the book, I suppose in certain ways I'm trying to like persuade you to read the book or give you a way in. I mean, I guess part of my thought was when I looked at what we had up on the shelves in the faith and meaning section of the library, as much as everything I said about, well, and you can see the relevance for Taylor, yeah, we're located at the intersection of various different traditions. We should avail ourselves of the texts and the various resources that come to us from these traditions. At the same time, those shells can end up being pretty intimidating. And I mean, the weight of history, you can like quickly get to the point where it sort of feels like, well, I have to become an expert in everything in order to like ask the most fundamental question of my life. And that can't quite be the case. So anyway, my hope is that, well, first of all, I'll just let you know, this book is much less intimidating than anything else Charles Taylor has read. I believe both Sources of the Self and A Secular Age are also on the shelves of the Grace Farms Library. This book was originally delivered as a series of lectures over the radio, over Canadian public radio. Just pause for a moment and consider the level of discourse in Canadian media versus in American media. But it's also back in '91. But this is relatively accessible. And my hope is that you might find your way into this book and find that it's helpful to you in your own pursuit, in your community's pursuit, in locating yourself in your history as you are. So I have just a couple of quotes I'll pop up. I'll switch back to slides again. And oh, right. I've had this problem before. Okay. And the first thing I want to do is basically give you, like, in certain ways, the thesis statement of the book, which is this. There is a certain way of being human that is my way. I am called upon to live my life in this way and not in imitation of anyone else's. But this gives a new importance to being true to myself. If I am not, I miss the point of my life. I miss what
being human is for me. And I should hasten to add, I misspoke when I said the thesis of this book, the thesis to which this book is responding, right? So if we backed up just a little bit earlier before that quote, we find him doing what Taylor does so well, which is telling the history of where an inescapable idea like this comes from, right? So you could sum up this thesis that I just read aloud here. This thesis, I think, has various sorts of slogans in our culture, or in our cultures. And one of them that my students at least recognize readily, the undergrads, is this basic impulse to say, you do you, right? What does it mean to be a good person? Only you can know for you. But what Taylor's trying to capture here is it's not just a sort of and that can just sound like adolescent arrogance. But Taylor's trying to say, no, there's an ethical idea here. But the first step, before he helps us understand the deeply profound ethical idea, is he wants to make sure that we understand that this impulse, that I have a particular way of being human that is my way, and that if I miss that, I miss the point of my life. He wants to help make sure that we understand that not every human being, to the extent to which we feel the weight of that, we need to know that not every human being who walked this planet has felt that way. So he does, like I said, what he does best. He gives us the intellectual history. He says, Herder put forward the idea that each of us has an original way of being human. Each person has his or his own measure, is Herder's way of putting it. Herder's a 19th century German Christian theologian. This idea has entered very deep into modern consciousness. It is also new. Before the late 18th century, no one thought that the differences between human beings had this kind of moral significance. And so, I mean, this is really the sort of, like I said, the sort of one of the cruxes that Taylor's trying to set up for us, is the thought that like this impulse, and we can cash it out in theological language. In fact, it originally was cashed out in theological language by someone like Herder or someone like Friedrich Schleiermacher, who would be another source, another German theologian who would be a source for this idea. You could say that we have a vocation, each one of us. We have a calling before God. Kierkegaard will go on about this, that we have what Kierkegaard calls an eternal responsibility before God to live as an individual. That is, to live the life that only we, you have to make it singular, only I can live. I have that responsibility to live that sort of life. And Taylor says, it may be impossible to escape the sense that maybe impossible to escape the weight of that responsibility. But you need to know the inescapability doesn't mean it's universal. Because there are actually some fundamental lies built in to at least thin versions of this slogan, of this vision of flourishing life, right? On this account, flourishing life on this planet is flourishing when each individual is living their own individuality to their fullest. And Taylor says, well, what the rest of the book goes on to show is that even if you were bought into that ethical ideal, right? And by the time Kierkegaard is cashing this out in terms of vocation and an eternal responsibility before God, this isn't some flippant, like you do you, have fun. There's a real ethical weight here, right? That I need to live the life that only I can live. If you take that idea seriously, Taylor says, then you're actually going to see some of the fundamental limitations that may have been built into the idea to begin with. And one of the key ones there is the fundamental lie of individualism. The illusion that we imagine ourselves to be individuals. Taylor says that's just not true. And he goes on to give a couple of different answers to this, one of which I have here. Is that the general feature of human life that I want to evoke is its fundamentally dialogical character. We become full human agents capable of understanding ourselves and hence of defining an identity through our acquisition of rich human languages of expression. Another one of Taylor's books that I love is his philosophy of language called The Language Animal. If you have linguistic impulses, that would be worth picking up too. No one acquires the languages needed for self-definition on their own. We are introduced to them through exchanges with others who matter to us, what George Herbert Mead called significant others. The genesis of the human mind is, in this sense, not monological, not something each accomplishes on his or her own, but dialogical. And so Taylor's point is, even if you decided that the most important thing to do with your life was to be true to your most authentic self, you should be careful immediately to recognize that probably that there's a good chance, at least in 21st century West, I will add, dominated by, I think, like various problematic ideas of whiteness, you will imagine that self that you imagine may be sort of much more freestanding than it actually is, right? And you need to realize that even that self that you're trying to be faithful to, that self was itself and is itself all the time being created and maintained in dialogical relationship. Taylor goes on to say, even if you were alone on an island in the South Pacific, the woman who gave birth to you, the people who raised you, the community that taught you your language, these are all other voices that you carry around with you in your head, and they constitute this dialogical self. When we think, I don't know about you, but I relate to that, right? The sense that, like, when I try to think my thoughts, I'm in dialogue with important others in my life. Some of them are my colleagues at Yale, my colleagues at Grace Farms, but even more significantly, right, my parents, my grandparents. Recently, during quarantine, I've been walking in West Rock Ridge Park, which is right near my house here in New Haven. And I've been discovering the connections of my family. I didn't know I had any roots in Connecticut. I grew up outside of Chicago to parents who both whose families came from Ohio. But anyway, I've been discovering, like, oh my goodness, these judges who signed the death warrants of Charles I and fled to New England to seek safety in a cave not more than 3 miles from my house. They're actually like my great uncles. And I've been thinking through, what does it mean to be related to these? To be authentically myself, I think, means to be in real relationship to these men, yes, as patriotic heroes of some sort, but up on that rock, it says, opposition to tyrants is obedience to God. But these men, which is a powerful sentiment, but as I've been reading more about the history of these men, you realize, well, they may have been opposed to the tyranny of the Crown of England, but they were blind to the tyranny of white settlers in America against indigenous peoples. They were blind to the tyranny of white settlers and African slaves. They were. So what does it mean? So to be me, I think, means having an honest, real relationship with that history. And I think that's what, so that these significant others become this, those are sort of the building blocks from which Taylor ultimately says what he calls a horizon of significance appears. And that horizon of significance is a sort of, once you get like all of these different dialogical selves, like in dialogue with one another, what sort of emerges, would be my language for it, are these horizons of significance where my individuality actually becomes significant against some shared horizon where we at least agree on what sorts of differences are actually significant. And much of the book is trying to articulate that distinction, because Taylor's worried that if we don't attend to that, if we start with some atomistic idea of an individual, our individuality becomes trivial if we don't attend carefully to history and our historical locatedness, our social locatedness, and all the rest. Final thought. that I want to make sure we highlight before we jump into some conversation is Taylor calls his whole work a work of recovery, which is a category that's been really meaningful to me. And you can sort of hear, and it's totally expected if you're a little bit puzzled. You can get to the end, you can spend a lot of time. I've taught this book for like 5 years now. And you can get to the end of the book and say, so is Taylor for authenticity or is he against it? Right? Like a basic question. He ends at it's ambiguous at the end. Well, and part of it is because he's we'd say strongly ambivalent, right? He has strong feelings on both sides. But part of that is because of the kind of work that he's doing, which he calls a work of recovery, which is a method of critique that doesn't work by trying to just like tear down what he's trying to critique, but rather trying to champion a particular way of construing what he's critiquing. And I've been wrestling with this. At first, I think I would regularly commend this to my students as like, this is how you should interact with ideas. This is a charitable way of reading ideas with which you are unfamiliar. Rather than the first time you find something you don't agree with, you just try to like burn the whole thing down, which is a very undergraduate sort of approach to great ideas that they encounter. No, you should engage in this sort of project of recovery. Are there some resources within this sort of idea itself that could help this idea become the best version of itself? That's, I think, one way of thinking about what Taylor is trying to do with authenticity. He's trying to say, okay, well, there's something here that I think if you walked out your best impulse here on this ethic of authenticity, then I think you would actually answer all of these critiques that you're getting from various folks. But I think there's something even more powerful, maybe a more powerful way of thinking about what he's doing with this work of recovery. Because the danger there is if you go encounter somebody else's great, sort of deepest convictions about the nature of flourishing life, it has a very like patronizing, colonizing sort of posture to have, to say like, well, I'm going to help you see the real sort of kernel of truth here at the center of your convictions. And I will then, I will critique what I find sort of lacking in your view by showing that even according to your own best principles, you should share my critiques. That may be effective rhetoric, but it can be a violent rhetoric. I think a more powerful way of thinking about this work of retrieval or work of recovery that Taylor's invested in is to go back to what we started with, which is the locatedness that he's inviting us to take really, really seriously. That what he's trying to do is do a work of recovery vis-a-vis an idea that he thinks we're inescapably already invested in. And that may make all the difference. And that may also explain some of his ambivalence. I think Taylor has a certain amount of sort of like historical determinism would be the fancy word for it, right? Some sort of thought that like, because you live today, you just have certain intuitions that you are not going to be able to shake. Now, again, we could ask the question, and the question I found preparing for today in light of everything else that I've been thinking and writing about has been, to what extent is the implied audience of this book, I think, is especially like a white North American audience. There may be particular sort of tendencies towards, like I said, imagining oneself as the universal human that I think is a particular feature, not of humanity in general, but of whiteness in particular. But even there, to the extent to which we do find ourselves, of course, whiteness can have taken up residency in our minds, no matter what our skin looks like, no matter what our histories are. He says, to the extent to which this idea of authenticity sort of lands for us, that's the reason and the warrant to do this work of retrieval, is that you may not be able to like unthink it. So maybe the best thing you can do, the moral, ethical thing that you can do, is try to think it honestly, right? And that that key sort of thought, which is don't let yourself get duped into thinking that you are a self-standing individual. Even if you feel a responsibility to be true to yourself, know that that self is already dialogical. It came from somewhere. It's in dialogue with a community that's been constantly being formed. It extends back through history and histories that you can't escape. And if you do that work, then Taylor, I think, does have some hope that this ethic can actually drive us to find our sort of shared horizons of significance, our shared, yeah, it's not quite shared values. It's one level more abstract than that, but our shared sense, at least, of what matters. And it will drive us to recognize one another in really significant ways. Much more the escape, Taylor says, from a sort of society in which we're all desperately trying to sort of project ourselves, and especially for like the 20 somethings that I work with, this is like they're constantly trying to like present themselves to the world in some sort of way, and social media makes this only worse. He says the remedy for that may be an ethic of recognition, where what we're doing, instead of applying all of our energy to trying to like discover our truest selves and present those to the world, is to try to, with these significant others, with these deep friendships, to be invested in relationships to the point where you can actually help someone with this work for themselves and say, like, you know, I see this. This is who am I? But this is what I see in you. This is what I wonder, could this be who you are? Is this part of, again, to use theological language, is this part of your calling? Is this part of your vocation? All right, I went longer always than I want to. But those are some ideas, at least, to put on the table. This sort of big idea of that there's some way of being human that only that is your way, and that the meaning of your life is in some ways realizing that. Understanding that the self that undergoes that whole process is not isolated, but is built on significant relationships, dialogical relationships with significant others, and its difference and uniqueness is set against some sort of shared and negotiated horizons of significance. And then this question of sort of this work of recovery to say, once we come to terms with our own locatedness, how do we act ethically with some of these ideas, knowing that they are both maybe inescapable and problematic, right? What do we do? And I think Taylor's sort of method here of trying to find what might be the sort of powerful idea at the center from which we can maybe reform the whole, that might be a useful strategy for us. All right, questions, protests, comments. Lorraine.
Hi, good afternoon. So happy to be joining this group again. I participated when we did it live the last time at Grace Farms. So my question is, so regarding a work of recovery, does that mean, is that the same thing as there's no original thought?
That's a, do you want to just give me like one more sentence on that? Make sure I'm getting the force of your question.
Well, you know, I've heard in or read in a lot of different places that there's no original thought, because we're all at the same, as although we're all individuals, we're also a collective, and so that's where that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I think that is, I mean, part of what, again, Taylor has this whole philosophy of language that lies behind what he's doing. And I mean, you heard the idea just briefly, sort of ran through it, but this thought that language is maybe the easiest place for him to point to make something like the point that you're making, right? Just say, if you were really just trying to like come up with something truly novel, truly new, recognize that the only way you could communicate that is with a language that you've received from communities that have been using that language for, well, languages evolve, right? So human language has been evolving for millennia. And that is not just a sort of neat little accident. For Taylor, that has like serious philosophical significance. And so it does mean that we need to sort of give up on, again, on some sort of fantasy of disembedding ourselves, that somehow, oh, that was true for, because this is often what happens in sort of modern Western imagination, is that we imagine that other people, like when we look back in time, or with the wrong sort of sort of armchair anthropology sort of posture, we look over there. We think that back then and over there, maybe people, we can see how people are sort of formed by their contexts and whatnot. And maybe their thoughts were less original, or we can explain sort of where their thoughts and ideas come from. But ours are somehow, right, de novo. They're entirely new and our own. So I think that is part of what Taylor's trying to say, is like, don't just give up on that illusion. But I think what he's trying to say with the work of recovery then is admitting that that all the raw material you might have to work with intellectually, or even like ethically and morally for yourself, admitting that all that material is just given to you, or it's out there. It's not, didn't come from you. Your only ethical choice, really, in a certain way, is how to respond to that. He's trying to say that, but that response still matters, is right. It would be one way of trying to say this work of recovery. And so you can take what feels inescapable to you, right? So you can sort of see these steps, right? First, there just are things that are inescapable for you. Second step is to make sure that you can recognize that fact, that there are these inescapable things. Third, know then that those things came from somewhere. They have histories, because the easiest thing to say is it's inescapable, therefore it's universal and necessary. Nope. Recognize instead that they came from somewhere. But then fourth, there's a step of then trying to like do something with that material, right? To understand yourself. And I think that's, for me, that sort of helps me. That's the way I think about traditions. And I often use the word tradition in various things that we do. To me, a tradition is precisely something that you receive that helps you get over the illusion that you alone sort of can make your way in the world. But it's also crucially something that every time we receive a tradition, we just, even if you tried your hardest not to change it, you're still going to change it, right? So it's that understanding that that's where your agency lies, but then also taking that agency very, very seriously as a sort of locus of, as the site of your ethical agency. Does that get it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So does that relate to talent as well, in terms of like master artists like Picasso and Rembrandt? They can do things that I can't do, but is that an original artwork, or was that channeled to them through some kind of graduation process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I hear in my head right now, Barack Obama's language that I think he got in trouble with. I forget during which election it was, right? When he said, like, you built this business, you didn't build that. You didn't build the roads that bring your products to your customers. You didn't build the infrastructure that you didn't educate the workers who come your way, right? So I think it's that sort of thought that, yeah, talent itself probably emerges from a complex interaction of, I mean, we're inclined always to go to genes first, right? But like, I think Taylor would want to say histories and communities and of course, like audiences that recognize something as talent, right? So I think he's just trying to, again, help us see the bigger picture and the locatedness of each one of us, and maybe even move us away in certain ways from the sort of hero, whether that's the artistic hero who's like the once in a generation talent, or right, which I think is another sort of weakness of the authenticity ethic. That's like, me and my life alone, I will sort of achieve this great thing, and understand that whatever we achieve or whatever counts as achievement for us is itself something that we've received and we've had to negotiate
historically and socially.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. Other thoughts? Other questions? Bob, go ahead.
Hi. I don't know how I can explain this question, but it's got to do with relativism and whether or not Taylor would, his name's Taylor, right? He would,
Yep.
Charles Taylor, how he would feel about whether or not there are any such concepts as an eternal truth.
Yeah. That is a huge topic for Taylor. I had one more quote that I was thinking about sharing, which might be relevant now. So I'll pop it up. But he says, so this would be one place to go to see sorts of things he has to say on this topic. Only if I exist in a world in which history or the demands of nature or the needs of my fellow human beings or the duties of citizenship, I think singular, or the call of God or something else of this order matters crucially, only if, right, something not relative is the case. Only then can I define an identity for myself that isn't trivial. Authenticity is not the enemy, not the enemy that, I should look this up. Something went wrong in my, this is embarrassing because this is from a lecture slide that I've used before, of demands that emanate from beyond the self. Rather, it supposes such demands, right? So for Taylor, it is important that he thinks some of these horizons of significance, even though they are socially negotiated, he thinks that certainly for many people, as we negotiate them, one of the claims that's made about these horizons of significance by some is that they aren't, we may need to socially negotiate it, but we're in that process of social negotiation is aiming at like something like the truth. And we're making claims that I hope we're landing at what is the truth, what is in fact the case, right? And certainly if you are committed to language, I think, of something like the call of God, but it doesn't have to be religious, right? It could be, as he's saying here, the needs of fellow human beings, certain, sort of ideas of universal human rights. I mean, these are universal, there's no relativism in a sort of discourse, in a robust discourse of human rights, something often missed. But that's the case, right? So there are any number of these things. I think. So that's one of the charges that that gets laid against the sort of the group that Taylor calls the boosters of the authenticity ethic, who are basically a group of like undergraduates in the late 80s and early 90s. So that means that we didn't get quite fully into the social situation. The social situation for that occasions this book is one that we just see repeating itself over and over and over again. So step one, undergraduates have some new idea, way of thinking about their lives in the world. Their college professors get really, really worried about it, and various degrees of clutching pearls or whatever, like write all sorts of skies falling sorts of screeds in the New York Times, or they write books or whatever. So it was one of those. And so really, in certain ways, like Taylor, so this idea bubbles up in the 80s. Alan Bloom writes his book, The Closing of the American Mind, against this idea, and basically says any ethic of authenticity, not that he's using exactly that language, but anything that goes in this direction necessarily entails relativism among any number of other problems, and for that reason needs to be rejected out of hand. And Taylor, in some ways, is trying to come along as a sort of kinder critic, to say, well, hold on. If it does entail moral relativism, then I think then Taylor says like, well, then I would be against it too. But I think on its own terms, at its best, it it actually works against moral relativism because of this sort of requirement that my individuality not be trivial. And if my individuality isn't going to be trivial, then that means it has to be indexed to something outside the self. And once you're indexing the fundamental meaning and worth of your life to something outside the self, I think he says relativism is out the window.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I get it. Thank you.
Now, one thing I have never quite been able to figure out is how did those undergraduates or their other sorts of like intellectual defenders sort of receive Taylor's response? It's notable to me that there are courses taught at Yale. There's one in particular that's just called authenticity. Taylor is taught late in that syllabus. And this is not the text that is taught. So I've been wanting to talk to my colleague in the religious studies department about this. So I think that for many, relativism is not a bug; it's a feature, right? That's actually that's not a, oh man, if we pursue this line of reasoning, we have to somehow make peace with moral relativism. For some, that's oh no, once you realize that like my life is indexed fundamentally to some different standard than yours is, well then we get relativism. I forget her name. There's a philosopher at NYU or Columbia, maybe at NYU, who's done some really interesting, so in philosophy, relativism is basically just like a non-starter. It just breaks a basic philosophical principle of the principle of non-contradiction. But again, it's interesting to see. I heard this presentation in last June. No, more recently than that, October, November. Anyway, this contemporary philosopher is doing this work where she says, all right, maybe like logically, we're just always gonna have this problem as a discipline with this idea. But can we at least ask, like, what are people who adopt this idea, knowing like just how like intellectually like costly it is to start to say like, in philosophical language, P and not P can be like affirmed at the same time. Like all of logic like falls apart from there, is what a philosopher would say. But she says like, well, what are they getting out of this? Like, why would they pay that cost? And generally, there's social benefits, namely like we can get out of really difficult conversations and disagreements by saying true for you, true for me. Now we're done. We don't even have to say agree to disagree, because now we're not even talking about the same thing anymore. You're talking about what's true for you. I'm talking about what's true for me. And there's a sort of social peacemaking going on there. And whenever I have a chance to sort of speak to an intergenerational crowd about these questions, I think it's helpful for those of us who are, over 35 and troubled by an idea like relativism. I think we need to take stock, though, of the fact that what is driving many, many young people towards relativism, if we find that worrisome, is the poor model we've given them about what it would look like to contest with one another over the nature of truth, and still honor and respect one another in the process. And so these are people who've grown up in the era of cable news and are just like, try to like have a truth-seeking conversation. That's blood sport. Like, and I think it's for the sake of like love and concern for like other human beings that they take up this position. And I always just want to like recognize that. Again, there's no isolating the individuals. We're all part of a system that is producing these sorts of outcomes. Lorraine, did you have another thought? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well, I was just thinking as you were saying that about the American Indians. They have a way, or many Indians, they have a way of allowing young people to have children. And it's the elders, though, who actually rear the children because of the wisdom that they have. And so the young people, they have children and they go on and continue learn whatever they need to learn in life and work, and it's the elders. And I think that's a wonderful way of doing it, because I find that our culture has a way of doing away with experience. We, especially like corporate America, they throw out the experience for economic reasons. And so also I think just as a whole, we would be a much more thoughtful society if it was the elders who have had lived experience, who actually train the mind of the wonderful mind of a precious mind of a little child. So, and that's a wonderful way of recovery, I think.
Yeah, a dear friend of mine who's actually an elder at my church, the church that my wife and my daughter and I are a part of here in New Haven. He's Native American. He's actually writing I just saw my wife last week giving him written comments on an article that he's writing about the role of eldership, and trying to sort of like propose that there are indigenous ways of thinking about training up young people, and even more so for him, it's that language of eldership that you're talking about, right? Just try to establish that as a role in society. We have elders. We have elder care facilities, right? We like extract the elderly from our space, and that's just a tragic loss. The other thing that occurred to me point really well taken. The other thing that occurred to me as you were talking is, and in certain ways, and we're experiencing the malfunction of this right now with the pandemic. But in many ways, we do have a system where, at least from like ages 5 to like 18, or maybe a little bit longer, we do take children away from their parents for a majority of their waking hours, 5 days a week, and have them formed by some other people. But I think to your point, and certainly in higher education, I would ask this question: do we select those people? What role does wisdom play in the way that we think about selecting teachers, training teachers, thinking about what education is, what's happening in that time? And I certainly in the higher education space, wisdom is, I mean, it just sounds like unattainable and irrelevant. And yet I think it's like, I mean, that's the real, it'd be one way of, I think that'd be one thing that Taylor at least would be on, he'd sort of be on Alan Bloom's side about. It would be if you wanted to articulate a sort of wisdom crisis. Again, I think it's more in certain communities than in others. I think any sort of cultural community in which intergenerational families are much more the norm, like literally like intergenerational domestic living situations are the norm. I think you get a different sort of way that this cashes out. My wife grew up in a Korean American home in which there were at least 3, if not 4, sometimes generations like living together, and there were aunties and uncles, and there's a different sort of encounter with wisdom there. But again, if we're talking about sort of so-called mainstream culture, then I think you're quite right.
Yeah, I was thinking that in addition to that, because hate, I think hate is something that is taught, and generally it's taught at home. And it's sort of a generational thing. So one generation teaches the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. And so usually, not all the time, but usually the older generation has a little bit more wisdom.
Yeah.
And they might teach differently.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. and putting young people into classrooms with, well, anyway, like the Teach for America model, putting young people in classrooms with like a 23-year-old straight out of college. It's not the same sort of
Yeah.
formation.
Yeah.
That
Even
we're
in the
looking.
workplace, you know, I think when you have someone who's much older and they're under the instruction of a supervisor who's much younger than them. I have a friend who was complaining about that.
Yeah.
And it's not always a problem, because I don't think that age is necessarily always a factor, because I know some young people who are extremely mature for their age, more mature than me and other people I know. And it's all relative. It's not stagnant that way, but
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I want to be mindful of time and honor your time. I appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today. And thank you this is one of our first events that we're doing in this format. So I appreciate you sort of joining us for this, a little bit of an experiment. And I hope that you'll join us in a couple of weeks for that conversation about the cross and the lynching tree. I think it's an extraordinarily important book. It has been since it was written, but it is especially of the moment right now. And so pick it up, read it in the next couple of weeks. Come and have a conversation. James Cone. James Cone. One of the great Black theologians of, the 20th and 21st century. He just passed away, I believe, within the last year. But this is his last book.
And the title again is
The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's a work of Christian theology, but has far-reaching. It has much to say to anyone who's living in America, whether or not they have a particular attachment to the Christian tradition. So look forward to the conversation we can have. I look forward to sharing with you a little bit about that book and what we might learn from it, and to the conversation that it will spark.